In this video, we'll be covering everything you need to know for the Tudors and Stuarts. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you'd like to learn more about my full Life in the UK test course, head to uklifeprep.com, link in the description below. Let's jump in. The Wars of the Roses was a civil war that started in 1455 to decide who should be the next King of England. It was fought between two families, the House of Lancaster, led by Henry Tudor, and the House of York, led by Richard III. The war ended in 1485 with Henry Tudor killing Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Henry Tudor marries Richard III's niece to unite the families and becomes Henry VII and the first king of the House of Tudor. This was symbolized by the Tudor rose, which was made up of a red rose from the House of Lancaster and a white rose inside of it from the House of York. Here we can see the red Lancaster rose and the white York rose combine to form the red and white Tudor rose. Henry VII centralizes power and reduces the power of the nobles. Things I'd remember from this section would be the names of the two houses that fought each other during the Wars of the Roses, that Henry Tudor was victorious and the name of the battle where Henry Tudor was victorious, and the two colours that make up the Tudor rose. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, the War of the Roses was fought between which two houses? We saw that it was fought between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The next question reads, what colour was the Tudor rose? We saw that the Tudor rose was made up of the red Lancaster rose and the white York rose. Henry VIII was the son of Henry VII, and is most famous for breaking away from the Church of Rome, as the Pope refused to grant him a divorce from his first wife. As a result, Henry establishes the Church of England, where the king, not the Pope, holds the power. Henry VIII goes on to marry 6 times. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a Spanish princess, and gave him a daughter Mary, but she became too old to give him a son to be his heir, so he divorces her. His second wife was Anne Boleyn, who gave him another daughter, Elizabeth, and he ends up executing her as she is accused of taking lovers. His third wife was Jane Seymour, who gave Henry Edward the son he wanted, but Jane died soon after the birth. His fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, was a German princess he married for political reasons and divorced her soon after. His fifth wife was Catherine Howard, a cousin of Anne Boleyn, who was also executed as she was accused of taking lovers. I guess it kind of ran in the family. His sixth and final wife was Catherine Parr, who was a widow that survived Henry and married again soon after he died. During Henry's reign, the active government of Wales formally united Wales with England. Things I'd remember from this section would be the name of the church Henry established, why Henry established this church, how many times Henry VIII marries, and while rather painful to remember, I have seen questions on the name of Henry's wives and the names of the children born from them. And finally, that it was during Henry VIII's reign that Wales was formally united with England. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, Henry VIII married 6 times and broke away from the Church of Rome. We saw that this was true. The next question reads, which wife gave Henry VIII the son he wanted? We saw that Jane Seymour gave him Edward. At the same time when Henry VIII was cutting ties with the Church of Rome, a movement known as the Reformation was spreading across Europe, which was against the authority of the Pope and the ideas and practices of the Roman Catholic Church. A Christian group called the Protestants formed their own churches. They read the Bible in their own language and believed in the idea that a person's own relationship with God was more important than submitting to the authority of the Church. The English tried to impose their Protestant ideas in Ireland, and this leads to a rebellion, and we'll see later how this religious conflict has had significant ramifications for the development of Ireland and the UK as countries. Things I'd remember from this section would be what the Reformation was, and the name of the Christian group that grew in popularity during the Reformation. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, what is the movement against the authority of the Pope that occurred during the reign of Henry VIII? We saw that this was called the Reformation. The next question reads, which religion gained popularity during the Reformation? We saw that this was Protestantism. Henry VIII was succeeded by his son Edward VI, who died at age 15 and only reigned for 6 years. His main achievement was introducing the Book of Common Prayer to be used in the Church of England and is still used in some churches today. Edward was succeeded by his half-sister Mary. She was a devout Catholic who persecuted Protestants and got the lovely nickname Bloody Mary, but she too dies after a short reign. Mary was succeeded by Elizabeth I. She was a Protestant and was successful in avoiding any serious religious conflict by finding a balance between views of Catholics and the more extreme Protestants. She was successful in managing Parliament by balancing her wishes against those of the Houses of Parliament, and she was a very popular monarch, especially during her defeat of the Spanish Armada, which was a large fleet of ships sent by Spain to conquer England and restore Catholicism. Things I'd remember from this section would be who Edward VI was and the fact that he had a short reign, why Bloody Mary got her nickname, that Elizabeth I was a successful monarch, and what the Spanish Armada was and the date that they were defeated. Just a useful note, I would definitely spend more time remembering Elizabeth I's reign and her achievements, as this is where the questions seem to focus. Looking at some typical questions, who did the English defeat in 1588? We saw that this was the Spanish Armada. The next question reads, Elizabeth was skilled at handling Parliament, true or false? We saw that Elizabeth was successful in managing Parliament, and therefore this statement is true. The Elizabethan period, that is, during Elizabeth I's reign, was a time characterized by growing patriotism, which was the feeling of pride in being English. New trade routes were established, and the colonization of the east coast of America begun. Sir Francis Drake, who led the defeat of the Spanish Armada, circumnavigates the world, which means he sailed all the way round it on his ship, the Golden Hind. During this period, William Shakespeare, who many of you would already know about, writes many famous plays, poems, and sonnets. Some of his most famous plays include A Midsummer Night's Dream, Hamlet, Macbeth, and Romeo and Juliet. Things I'd remember from this section would be that it was during the Elizabethan period that the east coast of America was colonized, who Sir Francis Drake was and what he achieved, the types of literature William Shakespeare was famous for, as well as his most famous plays. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, who was reigning in when English settlers first began to colonize the eastern coast of America? We know that this was during the Elizabethan period and therefore was Elizabeth I. The next question reads, which two plays are written by William Shakespeare? Looking at the available options, the correct answer is A Midsummer Night's Dream and Romeo and Juliet. When I was preparing for the Life in the UK test, I had absolutely no knowledge of the history and development of the monarchy, so I found it extremely difficult and overwhelming to visualize who everyone was. What I've done here is made a simple family tree summarizing each monarch, their achievements, and their relationships with one another. As you can see, our first monarch during the Tudor period was Henry Tudor, or Henry VII. Henry VII was succeeded by his son Henry VIII. Henry VIII was succeeded by his son Edward VI, who was then succeeded by his half-sister Bloody Mary, who was then succeeded by her half-sister Elizabeth I. Next to each person, I have provided a short summary of important facts relating to them, which I have already covered at length, so I won't go through it again, but feel free to pause the video if you would like to read it. In the next few sections, I'll be continuing to add other monarchs to this family tree, and by the end of this topic, you'll have a very simple diagram summarizing who's who with key bits of information we need to know about them. Moving over to what was happening in Scotland during this period, they too were strongly influenced by Protestant ideas and abolished the authority of the Pope, made Roman Catholic services illegal, and established a Protestant Church of Scotland. The Queen of Scotland, Mary Stuart, or often called Mary Queen of Scots, was Catholic, and was crowned king at 1 week old when her father died, and she spent most of her childhood in France. When she returns to Scotland later in life, She becomes the center of a power struggle, and when she is accused of killing her husband, she flees to England and gives her throne to a Protestant son, James VI of Scotland. Mary, Queen of Scots, expecting to be welcomed by her cousin Queen Elizabeth I, is instead thrown in jail for 20 years and then executed, being accused of plotting to take over the English throne. I mean, I've heard of family feuds, but this is taking it a bit far. Things I'd remember from this section would be the names of Mary, that she was a Catholic, where she spent most of her childhood, who she was accused of killing, that she was related to Elizabeth I, and that she was imprisoned and executed. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, Mary Stuart, or Mary Queen of Scots, was a Protestant, true or false? We saw that she was a Catholic, and therefore the statement is false. The next question reads, Mary Queen of Scots was related to Elizabeth I, true or false? We saw that Mary Queen of Scots was Queen Elizabeth I's cousin, and therefore the statement is true. The last question reads, where did Mary Stuart spend most of her childhood? We saw that she spent most of her childhood in France. Elizabeth I had no children, so when she died, her cousin, James VI of Scotland, is made King of England, becoming James I of England and VI of Scotland. Even though James was king of both Scotland and England, Scotland still remains a separate country. During James's reign, he develops the King James Bible, which is also known as the Authorized Version. Things I'd remember from this section would be that James was related to Elizabeth I, the name of the King James's Bible. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, James VI of Scotland was related to Queen Elizabeth I, true or false? We saw that James VI of Scotland was the cousin of Queen Elizabeth I, and therefore this statement is true. The next question reads, the version of the Bible created by King James I is known as what? We saw that this was the Authorized Version. During this period, Ireland was an almost separate Catholic country. Henry VII and VIII extended control beyond the Pale, which was the area just outside of Dublin, and established English authority over the whole country. Henry VIII took on the title King of Ireland. However, during the reign of Elizabeth I and James I, there were many rebellions from the native Irish who opposed Protestant and English rule. In order to strengthen English authority in Ireland, the English government encouraged English and Scottish Protestants to settle in Ulster, which is a northern province of Ireland. We can see this region on a map here. These people formed settlements and took land from Catholic landowners known as plantations. This section is actually not too critical in terms of things I'd remember, but I'd suggest probably still remembering the following: who declares themselves King of Ireland, and what the plantations were. Looking at a typical question, the question reads, the plantation settlements in Ireland during the 17th century led to Protestant farmers replacing Catholic landowners, true or false? We saw that this statement was true. Like before, I have provided a family tree summary of the monarchs for this period. We have Mary Stuart, or Mary Queen of Scots, who is succeeded by her son, who initially becomes James VI of Scotland, but then later becomes James I of England and VI of Scotland. Like before as well, next to each person I have provided a short summary of important facts relating to them, so please feel free to pause the video if you'd like to read it. Zooming out now, our previous family tree looked like this. But we can see now how it has progressed by adding on Mary Queen of Scots and James I and VI from this section. James I of England and VI of Scotland was succeeded by his son Charles I. Both James and Charles were not successful in managing Parliament, as they believed in the principle of the divine right of kings, which was the idea that the king was appointed by God and did not need to seek approval from Parliament. For 11 years, Charles found ways to raise money without Parliament, but was forced to recall Parliament as he needed additional funds for his army due to a Scottish army forming when he tried to impose his prayer book in Scotland. Even after the Scottish army invaded, Parliament still refused to give him the funds, as many of them were Puritans, which were a group of Protestants who advocated strict and simple religious doctrine and worship, and strongly disagreed with Charles's religious views. Things I'd remember from this section would be what the idea of the divine right of kings is, and who the Puritans were and what they believed in. Looking at some typical questions, The first question reads, Charles I believed in the divine right of kings, so he tried to what? We saw that he tried to rule without parliament, and therefore option A is correct. The next question reads, the Puritans believed in simple and strict religious doctrine and worship. We saw that this was true. In addition to the unrest happening in Scotland we saw before, another rebellion was forming in Ireland due to their fear of the growing power of the Puritans there. Parliament was getting increasingly fed up with Charles I, so they saw this as an opportunity to take control of the army. This resulted in a civil war between the Cavaliers, who were supporters of the king, and the Roundheads, who were supporters of the Parliament. Charles I and the Cavaliers are defeated at the Battle of Marston Moor and Naseby. Charles I is initially held prisoner, but is still unwilling to reach an agreement with Parliament, so he is executed in 1649. Things I'd remember from this section would be the names of the two prominent opposing groups during the Civil War, the names of the two Civil War battles, and that it was Charles I who was executed. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, which two groups were prominent during the English Civil War? We saw that it was the Cavaliers and Roundheads who fought against each other. The next question reads, which two are Civil War battles? We saw that the Civil War battles was Marston Moor and Naseby. Following the execution of Charles I, England declared itself a republic called the Commonwealth. The army was in control and there was no longer a monarchy. Over in Scotland, the people there did not agree to the execution of Charles I, who was also their king, so they declared his son, Charles II, as king, who then leads an army into England but is defeated at the Battle of Dunbar and Worcester. Charles II flees to Europe by famously hiding in an oak tree on one occasion. Oliver Cromwell, who was the general of the English army and defeated Charles II, is given the title of Lord Protector, which basically made him the leader of the new republic. As a result of defeating Charles II, Parliament now controlled Scotland as well as England and Wales. Things I'd remember from this section would be what Charles II famously hid in before he fled to Europe, and who was given the title of Lord Protector. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, how did Charles II manage to escape to Europe? We saw that he famously hid in an oak tree. The next question reads, who was given the title Lord Protector following the English Civil War? We saw that this was Oliver Cromwell. After 11 years of being a republic and following the death of Oliver Cromwell, the people of Britain wanted stability and clear leadership, and therefore wanted a king again. This led to what is known as the Restoration, where in 1660, Parliament invited Charles II to come back from exile to be crowned as king. Charles II had no desire to go on his travels again and understood he could not do as he pleased but had to reach an agreement with Parliament, and during his kingship, Parliament generally supports his policies. The Church of England again became the established Church of England, and both Roman Catholics and Puritans were kept out of power. From this section, I'd remember what the Restoration was. Just a useful note here. When I was learning this, I got easily confused between the Restoration and the Reformation. They sound similar, but are very different. The Reformation, which we saw much earlier, was the movement against the authority of the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church, whereas the Restoration was the re-establishment of the monarchy by recrowning Charles II as king. Looking at some typical questions now, the first question reads, the Restoration refers to King Charles I being restored as king. We saw earlier that it was Charles II being restored as king, and therefore the statement is false. During the reign of King Charles II, there were a number of important developments. In 1665, there was a major plague in London, and the year after, there was a great fire that destroyed much of the city. The Habeas Corpus Act in 1679 made it illegal to hold a prisoner without giving them a court hearing. The Royal Society was established to promote natural knowledge, and is today the oldest surviving science society. Its two famous members include Isaac Newton, who discovered the existence of gravity, and Sir Edmund Halley, who successfully predicted the return of the comet, now called Halley's Comet. Things I'd remember from this section would be what the Habeas Corpus Act was, what the Royal Society was, who Isaac Newton was and what he was famous for. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, what did the Habeas Corpus Act introduce? We saw that it introduced that prisoners could not be held unlawfully, and therefore option B is correct. The next question reads, Isaac Newton was a famous painter. We saw that Isaac Newton was a famous scientist, and therefore this statement is false. Charles II had no legitimate children, so when he died in 1685, his brother, James II of England, Wales and Ireland, and 7th of Scotland became king. James was a Roman Catholic who favoured Catholics, which caused a lot of disruption in the army and parliament. James only had daughters, but people became increasingly concerned about his position as king after the birth of a son. William of Orange was a Protestant ruler from the Netherlands and was married to James's eldest daughter, Mary, making him James's son-in-law. Important Protestants in England asked William to invade England and proclaim himself king, and as this was all pre-planned, when William arrived in England, there was no fighting, so this event was later called the Glorious Revolution. William became King William III of England, Wales and Ireland, and 2nd of Scotland. I mean, you gotta give it to the guy. I'm not sure I'd have the same courage to steal my father-in-law's throne. My wife would definitely have me sleeping on the couch. James flees to France and comes back to try take his throne back by invading Ireland with a French army, but William defeats him at the Battle of Boyne, and James flees back to France. James also had support from Scotland, and an attempt at a rebellion was quickly defeated, with all Scottish clans required to accept William as king and take an oath. The MacDonalds of Glencoe were late in taking this oath and were massacred. There were some in Scotland who still supported James, and these people became known as Jacobites. Things I'd remember from this section would be who James II and 7th was, who William of Orange was, what the Glorious Revolution was, and which Scottish tribe was massacred. Looking at some typical questions, the first question reads, William of Orange was asked by Protestants to invade and there was no resistance. This was called We saw that this was called the Glorious Revolution, as there was no fighting involved. The next question reads, which Scottish clan was killed for not taking an oath? We saw that this was the MacDonalds of Glencoe. Like before, I've provided a family tree summary of the monarchs of this period. Firstly, we have Charles I, who is executed, with Oliver Cromwell stepping in as Lord Protector. Charles II is then made king following the Restoration, and is succeeded by his Catholic brother, James II and 7th, who is then succeeded by his son-in-law, William III and 2nd, following the Glorious Revolution. Zooming out now, this is the family tree we had from before. And we can see now how the monarchy progresses with Charles I and his successors. Hi there, my name is Dan and I hope you enjoyed watching. I've posted this video for free on YouTube, and if you've liked what you've seen and want to access my full Life in the UK test course, then head to uklifeprep.com, link in the description below. In my course, I've completely stripped down the official guide and cut away all the nonsense to focus on what you actually need to know for the questions that are actually asked. Having prepared for the test myself, I know firsthand how painful it is going through 150 pages of dense facts and not having a clue the types of questions you'll get asked. I've used my 10+ years of experience in online education to build an easy to follow online course that promises to get you 100% ready in the shortest amount of time possible. To show your support and get updates on any new videos I release, please subscribe to my channel by clicking here, and to watch more free videos that I have posted on YouTube, click the playlist here. I look forward to learning with you and wish you the best of luck in the test.